Alrighty, folks. So today we're going to be talking about the Mongols. Okay. This is 12B1, I think, for me in my class. I'm not sure what Mr. Nolan called it. Again, if you can't figure out kind of how this works at this point, then I don't know what to say anymore. So, who are the Mongols? Okay, so the Mongols are a group of tribal nomadic horse archers that come from Mongolia. Okay, so this has a lot of words in here, so let's unpack it. Okay, so the Mongols are basically a group of tribes that came together in like Central Asia. I'm going to show you a map in a second. But they were peoples that basically lived kind of off their horses. Okay, so the horse was key. They would use it to travel. They would use it for food. Believe it or not, the horse in this part of the world produced like milk that they would use to feed themselves. They would use it to hunt. They would use it for everything. Okay, so they would be super good at getting on these horses and basically fighting and hunting. Okay, they would use bow and arrows, and they were like pretty incredible warriors. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in a second. So they come from Central Asia, Mongolia, actually a little east of center, but nonetheless, they're led by a guy named Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan is one of those guys from history that we gotta know. Okay, so he's one of the most fearsome warriors who ever lived. So he actually unites all these tribes. He kind of creates the Mongol Empire, and the Mongol leader a lot of times is called the Khan. Okay, so the Khan is the leader of the Mongols, and Genghis Khan is the first leader of the Mongols, basically. So he's kind of the guy who ends up leading these people into battle. All right, and what they end up doing, the Mongols, is they kind of establish the biggest empire really in the history of the world. Okay, so this is huge. All right, so we have these kind of Central Asian areas where the Mongols kind of come from, and then they kind of invade Japan. Okay, then they start moving into the Middle East. Okay, they take over most of that territory there. They actually go into Russia, and they can take over huge amounts of territory. And they were actually heading towards Europe, okay? But what ends up happening is they don't continue on because they have to deal with their own political problems back home. Okay, one of the leaders dies, and this army has to go back home. So it turns out if that guy didn't die, that's one of the great what-ifs of history. What if the Mongols just kept conquering? Because believe it or not, these European knights, they, probably wouldn't have been able to stop this Mongol machine that they created. And we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so why are they important? Well, they created the largest empire in world history. So again, if you look at this map, this is one of the biggest, land empires in history, obviously. So a lot of people think that belongs to, the Roman Empire or some of these other empires, but not exactly the case. In my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions too, they had the best army ever. Okay, so keep in mind, China, okay, which is located here, this is during the 1200s. China's kind of the big dog on the block. So a lot of the Dark Age stuff still going on in Europe. Not exactly the most powerful region of the world. The Middle East is not as powerful as it used to be under those big Islamic empires. And China's kind of the big leader in military and culture and all that stuff. And the Mongols, they crush China. Okay, it takes a while for them to do it, but they do it. They crush the Middle East and they start heading into Europe. That's an impressive military feat. Okay, so the Mongols, one of the best militaries. Another thing they did was use brutal tactics. Okay, so they would go into a city and they would set up a wagon, and anyone who was taller than the wheels on the wagon, they would just chop their head off. Okay, so the Mongols killed millions and millions of innocent civilians. They used these brutal tactics to kind of inspire fear in their opponents and kind of help conquer, basically. Okay, so the Mongols were incredibly brutal. We learned how they sacked Baghdad, basically destroyed the whole city. That was in Iraq, and this kind of still has a legacy today. A lot of people think, some of these Mongol conquests were so brutal that, some of these areas never really recovered. And what's ironic about this is that the Mongols are often important in history, like for our purposes, we study, the general trends and, the overall importance because they facilitated trade between East and West. Okay, so look at this huge territory of the Mongols. okay, that goes from China all the way into Europe. Okay, so this is known as, the Silk Road, and they kind of reconnected east with west. And once the Mongols, brutally established their territory, they actually set up kind of a peaceful empire after they did that. Okay, because nobody wanted to mess with the Mongols. These people, you don't mess with Genghis Khan. You just don't do that. So they set up a peaceful empire, and then all of a sudden we have trade going, okay, between China into the Middle East, even into Europe. Okay, so the Mongols are definitely known, in history at least, as important because after all these brutal conquests, they facilitated trade. Now, were the benefits of that trade worth all those deaths and all those brutal tactics? I don't know. That's a tough question. Okay, so here's more example of those trade routes going through this huge Mongol empire into Europe, okay, all the way into China. Okay. Now, there's a territory in Eastern Europe, basically, that we call Russia. Okay, so it's close to the Byzantine Empire, and basically what ends up happening is the Russians are conquered, just like everyone else, by the Mongols. And Ivan the Great is a Russian leader who's going to throw off Mongol rule. He's going to centralize power, and he's basically going to create and expand this Russian nation. Okay, so power becomes centralized in the hands of a czar. Okay, this just means leader. It's kind of like king. The Mongols have their khans. That's their leader. The Russians have their czar. Caesar, Augustus. All these names are just words for the main leader. The Russians have their czar, and they're also influenced by the Orthodox Church, just like we mentioned earlier in the year. Okay, so Ivan the Great's actually the guy in Russia who helps get rid of the Mongols. So that's a picture of him here. Here's where it would start. If you want to pause and take a closer look, that's fine. But eventually Russia is going to expand and become important, more so in your study of history next year. But we'll get there, or you'll get there next year. Now, in Spain, this is kind of just one of those things we kind of got to throw in there. But two leaders known as Ferdinand and Isabella, okay, unify the country, and they start expelling Jews and Moors who... and Muslims, basically. So this is known as the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, so remember, the Muslims came up through Africa, basically, and they started trying to conquer territory in Spain. They were eventually stopped at a place called Tours. Okay, I'm not sure if that's exactly where Tours is or not, but the point is they were stopped at Tours by Christian armies. And what ends up happening is Ferdinand and Isabella, they're Christian people, specifically Catholic, and they want to retake Spain. So that's what they do. They retake Spain, and they start expelling people who aren't Catholic. This is known as the Inquisition. It actually got pretty brutal, and it was kind of an unfortunate stain on Spanish history. We'll go more into it in class. And eventually they're going to create a Spanish empire all throughout the Western Hemisphere under a guy, specifically Charles V, starts building this empire, and the Spanish Empire starts developing all these areas in red. So remember the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayas. Okay, so the Aztecs up here. Okay, the Mayans in Central America, and the Incans, okay, all conquered by the Spanish.